Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon. This will be an exciting lecture. Todd Styer is going to be talking about the Chinese language as shown in knowledge of Genesis by the Chinese people. And I'm just going to read Todd's brief biography here, and then he'll step up to the podium here. Todd has a Bachelor of Sciences degree in mechanical engineering and over 15 years of experience in industrial automation and robotics. Todd is a creation lecturer, and he teaches a 12-week course called Blinded by the Dogma of Science. We actually have some of his banners from his class in the gift shop area, so you're welcome to browse through those. Todd has over 20 years of personal study covering earth sciences and biology. His hobbies include studying artificial intelligence, quantum mechanics, and modern cosmology. So.
Thanks, Josiah. Boy, I sound like a geek when you hear it that way, doesn't it? But they're actually interesting fields. You should try them sometime. As Josiah mentioned, what we're going to talk about today, in a nutshell, is the historical and archaeological evidence for the knowledge of Genesis in the people who created the ancient Chinese language. And so a lot of detail that we'll be getting into supporting the claim, and I think you'll find it very interesting. Some questions that we're going to address during this lecture is, did the original Chinese people come from the Middle East as a result of the Tower of Babel dispersion? Is there evidence that they brought with them the knowledge and the belief in one God from the Mesopotamian region? Were they originally monotheists? Do the mysteries, ancient Chinese characters, have a biblical meaning little understood before? So were these things overlooked for all these years significant to what we're talking about today? And I think you'll see that they very much are. Did the inventors of the original Chinese characters, including those which are inscribed on ancient tortoise shells and bones referred to as the oracle bones, have knowledge of the Garden of Eden and a strong belief in the creation account that is contained in the sacred Hebrew Scriptures, the Bible? What was the meaning of the 4,000-year-old border sacrifice that the Chinese emperors observed annually? These ceremonies were done up until 1911, pretty much uninterrupted. And who was Shangdi that was worshipped at the border sacrifices? Are Shangdi and God of the Bible one and the same? So these questions are the things that we will be covering. During this lecture, we will be analyzing ancient Chinese written language, more modern Chinese written language, and written language of what is believed to be some of the earliest Chinese characters found inscribed on the remains of animals, the oracle bones I referred to earlier. We will cover the origin of the Chinese peoples and their various genealogies, the histories of many of their ancient rulers, and the evidence for the religious beliefs and religious activities of the ancient Chinese. We will also learn about how the religions and religious practices in China have changed during the last 4,000 years. We will make a watertight case that the earliest religion in ancient China worshipped the same God that Christians worship today. Since the Zhou dynasty, from 1122 to 255 BC, the name Shangdi has been used interchangeably with heaven or God. In fact, even the Shang dynasty, clear back from 1776 to 1122 BC, recognized Shangdi as the true supreme God. The following words were spoken by many ancient Chinese emperors during annual border sacrifice ceremonies, as recorded in the collected statutes of the Ming Dynasty. And here's a quote from one of those statutes. Of old in the beginning, there was the great chaos without form and dark. The five elements had not begun to revolve, nor the sun and moon to shine. You, O spiritual sovereign, first divided the grosser parts from the purer. You made heaven, you made earth, you made man. All things with their reproducing power got their being. Does this not sound very familiar with the early verses of Genesis? Xu Xing, which is known as the Book of History, records that the Emperor Shun in 2230 BC sacrificed to Shangdi. So this is going back quite a ways. This is over 4,000 years ago. Confucius stated concerning the border sacrifice, and by the way, there's references to this border sacrifice all over the place in ancient Chinese history. This is just a sampling. He who understands the ceremonies of the sacrifices to heaven and earth would find the government of a kingdom as easy as to look into his palm. So the sacrifice was offered at the eastern border of China first, way back, okay? And then about 450 years ago, it was moved, the ceremonies were moved to Beijing. And we'll actually talk about that a little later. During the 15th century AD, it was moved to the southern part of Beijing, and the altar of heaven, which is where the sacrifices of the bulls took place, like I said, was done up until 1911. And this tradition began back in 2205, possibly earlier than that, but that's the earliest records we can find of it, and again up until 1911. Is there evidence in the written language of the Chinese that supports the historical accounts in the book of Genesis? Several years ago, I became very interested in the scientific evidence that supports the accuracy of the Bible. During this research, I have learned that the creation account in the Bible occurred just as it says in the book of Genesis. So, sometime throughout my studies, I became aware of the evidence that the history written in the book of Genesis was known by ancient Chinese people before they developed a written language. And this extends beyond the Chinese as well. Various other cultures this is true for as well, but today we'll focus just on the Chinese. And the written ancient Chinese language clearly showed that they had knowledge of the creation account, the flood account, the dispersion of Babel, and other historical accounts contained in the Holy Bible. I'm not an expert in paleography, which is the study of ancient forms of writing and the proper deciphering of them, but I definitely was blessed with the time and ability to research this, and was fortunate enough to come across the workings of many people. I've spent about 30 years researching this subject. So my studies have included several books on the subject, internet research and library research. And much appreciation to authors Kang and Nelson for their tremendous groundbreaking initial work. As far as I can tell, they were the discoverers of this correlation between the knowledge of Genesis within early ancient Chinese characters, and in fact still remains in even more modern Chinese characters. As just one comment, like all written language and spoken language, over time it changes. It basically morphs, so we're going to be looking at kind of a combination of both the earliest known ancient Chinese characters, the ones on the oracle bones, and also we're going to be looking at more modern characters that are still used today. And the knowledge is still contained in both. During the exposures of the evidences you will be seeing during this lecture, you will need to regularly ask yourself this question: is this just a coincidence? Or is there something to this? And you'll see that the probability of this being just a coincidence is zero. The information has not been successfully refuted by anyone. Matter of fact, there's very little refutation of this available. The ones that do, they're really kind of silly, I have to be honest with you, and I actually do cover their arguments at the end of the lecture today if we have time to get to it. But they are in the printouts. Though there have been mistakes in the etymological analysis of some characters on the early works, they have been realized and removed from newer publications. So pretty much any book or any work that's been done on this since probably the mid to late 80s have had most, if not all, of the etymological errors removed or corrected. I will discuss in detail the common points that skeptics, which are primarily atheists, who detest the implications of the authority of the Bible being upheld by anything, have offered up against the discovery towards the end of the lecture, like I said. And let's look at the evidence together. You decide for yourself. You're about to see amazing evidence that the history contained in the book of Genesis is accurate. The first book in the Old Testament, for those of you who aren't real up to speed on the Bible and the book of Genesis, and that's one of the reasons why this went undiscovered for so long, is it seems like there's a lot of disconnect between people who know ancient Chinese history and also those who know the Bible. Very few know both, and I think that's probably why it's remained under the radar for so long. But just a quick little Genesis primer. The Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. It tells us that the first man, Adam, was made from the dust of the ground. I'm going to talk about the highlights here that you'll see how they correlate to the symbols in the Chinese written language. So that's why I'm kind of going through these. The first sin occurred in the Garden of Eden due to man being tempted by Satan. It was in the form of a serpent. The Bible clearly teaches that God exists in the heavens above. The Bible also teaches that man became so full of sin that he cast judgment on his creation and brought about a global flood that destroyed all land animals and humans. Only the animals and 8 humans on Noah's Ark survived. The ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, and the earth was repopulated. In other words, all people are descendants of these 8 people. It also teaches that God commanded Noah's family to fill the earth. Though man was instructed to go out and repopulate the earth, the great majority of people disobeyed, and they remained congregated within the Mesopotamian area. The Bible teaches that man, again, disobeyed God by remaining in the area and developing a great deal of pride and arrogance. Therefore, God confused their language at the Tower of Babel, and people then migrated to other parts of the world. There were some early hunters, adventurers, seafarers, and explorers who left their presence on many parts of the world prior to the Babel dispersion, but these represent the minority. Okay? And there's archaeological evidence that supports this. The Babel event took place between 2300 and 2200 BC. There was some dispersion of people prior to that again, but the evidence clearly supports the notion that all of the old kingdoms, each with their own language, were all established at about the same time after the Babel event. So, and there's evidence that supports that. The old kingdoms seem to have just kind of sprung up all about the same time. I wonder why that is. There's vast evidence that the earliest civilizations around the world abruptly began at about the same time and shared a common knowledge of technology, but had very different languages and lifestyles. The old kingdoms, which would all be post the Babel dispersion, were Babel, of course. They didn't disappear after the event. That was founded by Nimrod. Assyria, founded by Ashur. China, founded by Fohi. Egypt by Mizraim. Sumer, which is the oldest civilization that we have real solid archaeological evidence for. The Indus Valley, a civilization of India and Pakistan, which in the past was very different than it is today. It's pretty much desert, arid areas now, but once had rivers flowing through it, and there's satellite evidence for that, and lots of archaeological evidence. And we find harpoons in the middle of the desert out in that area. And of course, Mexico and Peru, which we're probably all familiar with the Mayan people in Mexico. And of course, there's ancient civilizations in Peru that really left a lot of interesting evidences that we won't talk about today. But many of these civilizations shared the same basic architecture of tunnels, pyramids, ziggurat towers. Ziggurat towers are basically stepped pyramids. Okay, megaliths, mazes, and others. The oldest civilization, Sumer, came from the highland region south of Ararat, where the oldest villages in the world are found, near where Noah's Ark came to rest. Interesting. I wonder why the oldest civilizations are located there. The most interesting thing is that the language of the ancient Egypt appeared fully developed at its first appearance in the first dynasty. What earlier civilization influenced Egypt? The only earlier civilization was in the villages and cities that were founded by Noah and his descendants prior to the Babel dispersion. As I mentioned before, there were various similarities in architecture between many of the world's earliest civilizations, which is evidence of migration from a common people. The Ziggurat Tower is one of the best examples of this shared knowledge. Ancient civilizations from all over the earth, from Mexico to the several dozen ziggurat towers that have been located in the Mesopotamian region, share amazing similarities. And you can see here where this is a typical city that contained one of these stepped pyramids. We've found about 30 of them in the Mesopotamian region alone. And you can see, here's an example of a Mayan pyramid, and this is one of the ones located in the Mesopotamian region and what it looked like in its heyday. Okay. Just a little side note, many Bible scholars think that the Tower of Babel refers to a ziggurat tower, which was the ancient pagan temple tower of the Babylonians. Babylon was located on the Euphrates River about 30 miles from the modern city of Baghdad in Iraq. The Babylonians bragged that their tower would eventually reach up to the heavens. Could this tower here, the Ur-Nemu Ziggurat, actually be the Tower of Babel? Some people actually believe so, some don't. There's not agreement here, but what's interesting about this is its location. It is about 50 miles southeast of Baghdad. Now that's important because it is described in Genesis 11 as being located in the land of Shinar, okay, which is ancient Babylonia, which is in Iraq and located 60 miles south of the present-day Baghdad. And the Bible says, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth." So could the location of this just be a coincidence? Yes, it could be. But the reason the coincidence is so striking is due to the tight geographical relationship. So you can see how some people would think that. Okay, the real history of the world. This would be post-flood that we're going to focus on, obviously. But just a quick look at the history of the world. There was an explosion of villages and cities immediately after the flood during what's referred to as the Golden Age. Okay, the climate was very different then. Okay, this is during the period of time of the climate having a lot more precipitation. This is if we go back to the Ice Age was formed. It took about 500 years for the ice pack to accumulate. It took about 200 years for it to melt during what's referred to as the Great Meltdown. Okay, so great hunters during the Ice Age. You can see here actually intentionally, most of them intentionally left to go hunt. Okay, and they typically were probably the more robust individuals. After all, they're going out and battling mammoths and things like that. So, and some stayed. Some did not come back. Some were not seasonal. They actually stayed out, and due to the small population of these peoples, you can see where there would be a lot of inbreeding, a lot of genetic problems. But, anyways, world exploration by ships flourished after the Ice Age, and there's evidence that it actually took place during the Ice Age. After the dispersion event at Babel, descendants of Ham and Shem early on, primarily Ham, and then later Japheth's ancestors migrated to China. So China is kind of interesting because there's historical evidence that initially Ham migrated there, and then Shem's descendants, and then Japheth's descendants. And we'll actually talk about that in a second here. But you can kind of see where you had the flood, and then you had the replenishing. This is when the animals and humans went out. And then you had the villages of the Golden Age. This would be just a few hundred years after Noah. And then you had trade networks established. And during that same period of time, you had the Stone Age, where you had people that left the area. They may have been sick people. They may have been people who didn't like the politics or the religion. It's hard to say, but definitely people prior to Babel left the area, and then they migrated to various parts of the world. And those are the Stone Age people that are actually found in the archaeological evidence for them. They were primarily hunter-gatherers. They did not take the technology with them. Okay, this is all pre-Babel. And then, of course, during the same time, you had, again, the mighty hunters, the cave dwellers, the You had the Neanderthals. And then you had the great, during this period of time, the ice was building, and you had these people actually up along the southern border of the ice pack. Okay, and there's evidence that there were just an amazing amount of animals along there because there was a lot of water and it was just very very rich with life. And so that's primarily where they were located. And then during the Great Meltdown, you had the ice pack actually providing a lot of water. Now remember, during the Ice Age, there was a lot of snowfall in the northern hemisphere and a lot of rain in other parts of the world. There was a lot more moisture in the air because the oceans were very warm because they were warmed up during the flood. The fountains of the Great Deep, all the catastrophic plate tectonic activity that was going on greatly warmed the oceans. So the oceans were warm. They stayed warm for about 500 years. And this is why the precipitation was so high. All right? So imagine that areas that weren't frozen, there was a lot of rain elsewhere. So raising cattle and the irrigation of land was not a problem. Food was very plentiful. And then you had the Great Desiccation Event, which was after the meltdown. The meltdown took about 200 years and provided water for the rivers in that area, flowed south. If you look at the Mississippi River, that's pretty much what created that. There was about 100 times as much water flowing through it during the Great Meltdown than there is today. And then during the Great Desiccation is when pretty much everything was melted down. The precipitation greatly diminished down to about what it is today. And these areas that were once full of life and lush with vegetation became deserts. And the Bible actually refers to this in many places. Okay, and it's interesting, there's some suggestion within the Bible that these great drying up events were actually supernatural, that they actually took place very quickly and not over a century or two. There's people that believe both, but anyways. There's certainly lots of archaeological evidence that these arid regions were not always arid, okay? Anyways, the descendants of Ham, including most Negroids, Mongoloids, and Negro-Australoids, aggressively migrated and covered an area from Phoenicia southward through Arabia and into Africa. Hamitic people were descendants of Ham, who were incredibly creative and inventive, the earliest explorers that spread cultivation and technology all over the world. Not as much as Shem, Shem's descendants and Japheth's descendants as far as maintaining the technology, but they were first, certainly the more aggressive, earliest people who migrated all parts of the world. Many of the original Chinese were Hamitic. Ham's descendants, or Semites, Shem's descendants, both. The Egyptians were Hamitic. In fact, most of the oldest traces of man throughout the world were Negroids, so it really supports what the Bible talks about and what the historical evidence suggests about Ham's descendants being very aggressive in exploring various parts of the world. The early Chinese migrants were then later supplanted by descendants of Japheth. Therefore, most Chinese people today are descendants of Japheth. In fact, Genesis 9:27 sort of explains why Japheth so successfully took over. And Genesis 9:27 tells of the fact that Japheth would assume the inheritances of Shem, and the Hamitic people would be their servants. Various ancient genealogies actually prove this. Now, by the way, servant is not a slave or anything like that. Actually, there was a lot of to be a servant carried a very different connotation than it does today. So just again, in China, Ham's descendants were first, Shem's second, and then Japheth's descendants migrated there last. The Bible actually says that God would actually enlarge Japheth's descendants, and so there was actually essentially help from God for them to basically supplant the other migrations. But one note I want to point out here is the Egyptians being Hamitic. There's a comment here that I think is very important. The secular timelines of of Egypt are wrong. This is the problem with people not being willing to let go of past mistakes. You gotta kind of like let them go. Look at what the archaeological evidence actually tells you, and that's actually what Dr. John Ashton did in his book that I believe is incredible. It's called Unwrapping the Pharaohs: How Egyptian Archaeology Confirms the Biblical Timeline. Basically, in his book, it shows that there's up to 800-year differences between the actual timeline that really took place in Egypt and the secular timeline. And this is important because typically the timelines of the Egyptian dynasties were used as evidence against the Bible, because when we compare the timelines, the dynasty that falls on where supposedly the Exodus took place, okay, there was no evidence of slavery or very little evidence of slavery. But if you correct for what the archaeological evidence tells you, use that timeline, they perfectly match. So this is big stuff. It's a fairly new book, and it's fascinating. Anyways, because a man sinned in the city, and because man was being disobedient, God confused their languages so that they could not communicate evil. This caused the people to disperse to other parts of the world. There's a belief that about 75 different verbal languages were supernaturally formed at that time. And of course, now they've evolved into the thousands of different spoken languages now. But due to man's disconnect and the tendency for men to group into villages and into distinct areas. But anyways, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 49, verses 11 through 12, it speaks of Shem, which is one of Noah's sons, of course, going to Sinim, okay, which is China. This makes a lot of historical sense because Shem's descendants were very religious and would have passed their religious knowledge down. And the remnants of what we're going to talk about today, okay, would have certainly, in my opinion, almost definitely came from Shem's descendants. Okay. Again, there is also evidence that some of Ham's descendants migrated to China early. The Mongolians were probably the descendants of Ham. Most scholars believe that. Canaan's son Sin, okay, may have been an early deified ancestor that the Chinese were aware of. And by the way, in China, there's basically Taoism, Buddhism, and of course the whole worshiping of ancestors. Okay, and so this is kind of possibly an example of this. And this would explain the connection between the Bible, the biblical name given to China, Sinan, and the Sinites of the Bible. It's possible that Sinites were actually people who worshipped Sin, the son of Canaan. The other interesting thing that supports this argument is the fact that the Chinese have always been identified by the prefix Sino. An example is Sinology, which is a study of Chinese history, or the Sino-Japanese War, okay, Sino being China. There's also much historical evidence from Josephus and many others that Japheth's descendants, who were philosophical intellectuals for the most part, migrated to China later. These people now make up most of the Chinese population. There seems to be no common ancestor for all the world's language families. We're going to spend just 2 slides on this. For example, Hebrew and Greek have no common language. Evolutionists cannot explain the origin of these independent families of languages. There is no evidence for the evolution of language because language did not evolve. I do a whole lecture series on this, by the way, but anyways, these are kind of the fine points. The Bible says that Adam and Eve had a complete language at the moment of their creation, in Genesis 2:3. This leads us to the analysis of the languages within the context of the Tower of Babel. So what evidence exists that exposes that all major language family groups were created by God during the Babel event and were then dispersed? Written languages that are symbolic in nature offer unique insight as to whether or not there was a common knowledge of history, which would tie people groups back to the Babel dispersion. And that's what's really nice about the written Chinese language, because it is a symbolic language. Many Chinese scholars over the years have predicted that there should exist evidence in other languages and other foreign histories which show knowledge of events that took place during the early days of Noah. After all, if the Tower of Babel actually took place, there should be a lot of historical and archaeological evidence for it. Okay? And guess what? There is. The examples in ancient Chinese language are just one instance which confirms the accuracy of these predictions. The processes of language change that are observed to have taken place within various languages did not fit a natural evolutionary paradigm like some evolutionists suggest. Like I said, I have a whole lecture on this, but grammar is decaying and vocabulary growth is from human intelligence. Okay? This is not evolution of language in play here. Grammar is getting less and less complex. The origin of the very complex original Indo-European grammar could not have risen naturally. Language change was often very rapid, and thus all languages could have come about since the 4,000 years since Babel, very easily. An example of the rapid rate of change which can occur in languages is the amount of change that took place in the Old English, the Anglo-Saxon language, between 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago. But since then, near stasis has occurred. I mean, if you look at the King James Bible, the King James Bible is not as far removed as some people have been told it is. It actually reads pretty easy, but if you go back 1,000 years ago, you couldn't even tell it was English. Many more examples that show how language is both designed and evolving can be reviewed, but I do not have time to go through all that in this short lecture. So, based on cultural and linguistic evidence for the apparent knowledge of the history of the Book of Genesis, that has been proposed that the Chinese originally migrated from the Mesopotamian region to China as a result of the Babel dispersion, like I said. So correlations found between the Chinese and Bablo-Assyrian art, sciences, and government are studied. The evidence of Genesis and the Chinese pictograms, which is what we're going to focus on today, is one of the best examples. If this is true, then there should be evidence of the historical events of the Mesopotamian region found in the historical documents of the ancient Chinese. So we will look at some of this evidence in detail. The goal here is to establish the accuracy of the Bible. There's also strong evidence that the earliest religion in China was monotheistic, and well, it's absolutely certain that they were monotheistic, and you'll see. And similar to the early Old Testament religion of the Hebrews. The other interesting detail about China is that it proudly claims the unique distinction of being the longest-lasting unbroken civilization, which provides for a continuous historical 4,500-year timeline. So that's what makes studying China so interesting within the context of the Babel dispersion. Does China's history and language provide extra biblical support for the Book of Genesis? So before we move on, I want to show you a little bit of the historical evidence here. The lineage of the Mautso, or the Mayas, people of China, is incredible evidence that they are not only descendants of Japheth, which is, you'll see from the chart that these genealogies are almost identical to the genealogies in Genesis. It's amazing, chapter 10. But also descendants of Adam. Their history claims that they are descendants of Japheth and knowledge of the early patriarchs that are contained in Genesis. The early Chinese missionaries were astounded when they discovered that the Maya people already were in possession of accurate knowledge of the Bible's Genesis creation accounts and the flood. They originally settled in what is now the Kangxi province of China, but were later driven out by later Chinese groups. In fact, the name Noah's wife is found in ancient Chinese descendant charts. Okay, and this isn't even in the Bible. Okay, let's look at these Chinese names closely, and it'll become clear that it matches the biblical genealogies found in the Book of Genesis. So, unfortunately, the print's a little small here, but the name Dirt here is obviously referring to Adam. This is an English rendering of a word from the Maya language meaning earth of clay. Okay. Seta, which is referring to the biblical Seth. Lama is the biblical Lamech. Nuah is the biblical Noah. And what's interesting is the Maya account actually has Noah being a righteous man that was commanded by God to build a great ark. And what's even interesting is in this knowledge, there's even reference to a dove being released. So it's very, very interesting. And then Gabulun. This is a rare naming of Noah's wife that is not even found in the Bible. Lohan, which is the biblical Ham. Loshen, the biblical Shem. Kusa, the biblical Cush. Meseh, the biblical Mizram. Nidshur, the biblical Ashur. Japhu, the biblical Japheth. Gomer, the biblical Gomer. Tutan, and most likely an adopted name. And the order is completely in precise order. None of these are out of genealogical sequence or chronological sequence. So, very interesting. I have all the reference material at the end. This chart was most likely from a book called From Adam to Abram. And I do have it at the end of the, it's on the last slide actually. It's actually in a couple locations, but that's. The oracle bones are pieces of bone or turtle shell used in world divination from the mid-Shang to early Zhou dynasties in ancient China. The source of the oracle bones was traced back to the modern Shutan, I guess I'm pronouncing that properly, village near Anyang in Henan province. Official archaeological excavations in 1928 to 1937 discovered 20,000 oracle bone pieces, which now form the bulk of the Academia Sinica's collection in Taiwan. The studies clearly showed that the origins of the Chinese writing system were initially hieroglyphic, that is made up of symbols with religious significance. The symbols used would have been commonly known and understood by the people, and that's really important. If someone is developing a language, they're not going to, if they're developing a symbolic language, they're not going to use symbols that nobody knows about. They're going to use symbols that everybody is very familiar with. Okay, this is important. The religion of Chinese people during the early development of the written language was clearly the same religion that existed in the Mesopotamian region and is contained in the Old Testament. So we're going to kind of start the study of the actual written language of ancient Chinese, and of course we're also going to be studying modern versions as well. So I'm not limiting it to just ancient. Okay, and it's okay if we kind of mix it up a little bit. I didn't think it was important to keep them distinguished, but I do point it out when I have a chance. Just real quick, early written Chinese language is made up of a system of word pictures that is typical of the calligraphy type written language of the ancient world. These word pictures are called pictographs and are referred to as radicals or key root words. I'll refer to them as radicals from now on. As the need to express more abstract concepts grew, various pictographs were combined to form more complex ideas called ideograms. Okay, these pictographs were typically made with symbols of common knowledge. It would be expected that the early ideograms would have used commonly known knowledge that is representative of history passed down by oral tradition. Okay? Therefore, the Chinese language itself is uniquely adapted to have recorded individual details of the history of the culture. We will see that the ancient Chinese recorded their knowledge of Genesis and creation in the written characters of their language. And you can see here, this is an individual radical. As you can see, this is a person. And you can see when you combine different radicals, you end up with an ideogram. So the most simplified one here would be a tree, two of them would be woods, and three of them would be forest. And of course, they get much more complicated than that, as you'll see. Ancient Chinese written language was made up of pictographs just as it still is today. It has changed much over the many millennia. All written languages have changed greatly as well. So. The Chinese written language is composed of 214 radicals and approximately 3,000 different combinations of pictographs. Though the spoken language differs radically between different areas, written Chinese, surviving thousands of years of history and civilization, is still transcribed pretty consistently throughout Asia. They use combinations of various graphically symbolic characters to express meanings that clearly show knowledge of Genesis. The evidence that the early people of China were immigrants from the Mesopotamian region who had knowledge of God, the Garden of Eden, and the flood is evident in the characters, as we will see. We're about to look directly at the evidence for the knowledge of Genesis in the written Chinese language. The information in this lecture was thoroughly researched, and I used my many resources to draw my information from. Dozens of books have been written on the subject in the last 25 to 30 years. They have become a lot more accurate and more complete I would say, the last 10 to 15 years. According to various resources, including Harvard's Chinese-Japanese Yenqing Library, the approximate time of origin of written Chinese language is about 2500 BC. Now this is interesting because it coincides with the time of the dispersion of races from the Tower of Babel. Again, is that just a coincidence? Note, the fact that very primitive and non-religious kinds of words are involved makes it very unlikely that the Chinese language was influenced by early Christian missionaries. Being religious and having knowledge of religion are two different things, okay? Also, it is clear, as you will see, that China was primarily a monotheistic religion. Don't mind the characters on the right. We'll actually get to them later. Okay. Besides historical evidence for this migration, let's look at the clues that are found in ancient Chinese written language. The Chinese ideogram for the word migrate, okay, is comprised of the following pictographic characters. Now, ask yourself, is this a coincidence? Now remember, this is all within the context of these people migrating from the west, from the Mesopotamian region, okay? The ideogram for migrate is comprised of great, the symbol for great, plus divide or separate, plus west, plus walk. And what's interesting is west is made up of one or the first, plus man, plus garden. So you take great plus divide or division, plus west, plus walking is migration. Very interesting. Okay. It is clear that the original religion of the ancient Chinese was monotheistic. It is evident that their written language was formulated within a monotheistic culture. They had no idols and no mythology. They worshipped a single supreme being. The polytheistic religions of Taoism and Buddhism, including ancestor worship, followed more than 2,000 years later. Okay? A lot of people think, oh, the Chinese have always been Buddhists. The Taoism or Taoism, which was based on the teachings of Laguage, was more of a way, he goes by a couple different names, but was more of a way to achieve personal enlightenment, while the teachings of Confucius, of Confucianism, dealt more with ethics and education. By the way, I don't think I get into it in the lecture, but Buddhism basically had its origins around 600 BC from northeast India. Okay. But anyways, the fact that there is an abundance of certain key words, I think it was the Nepal region, by the way. Anyways, the fact that there is an abundance of certain key words that reference back to the same historical events found in Genesis is overwhelming. A few of the common ones, Lord, these kind of repeat often, Lord, reptile, naked, clothing, sorrow, dust, flood, water. There are many dualities found between the histories and written language of ancient China and the history of Genesis. So we will show that ancient China was familiar with the Hebrew history of the Mesopotamian region 700 to 1,000 years before Moses wrote it. In fact, it appears that ancient Chinese language recorded historical accounts hundreds of years before the earlier books of the Bible were actually written down. So the first dictionary to analyze the original meaning of ancient Chinese characters was the Shu Wen, compiled by Xu Shen and presented to the throne in AD 121. Most Chinese dictionaries are still based on the Shu Wen. The problem is that these dictionaries only show a few of the Shang or the original oracle bone type, the oldest Chinese characters. And so most of them were not even in it. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that by Xu Shen's day, Taoists' ideas almost completely replaced the original ancient religious beliefs in a single creator God, known as Shangdi. Therefore, Xu Shen naturally analyzed the ancient characters within the context of the current knowledge of that period, and the true meaning of the characters were lost or became blurred because they no longer had relevant meaning. After all, if something doesn't mean anything, what's the point? The analysis that has been made of the evidence for the ancient writers having intimate knowledge of the creation account and of the Garden of Eden was not an easy task due to another difficulty. Scribes through the century expressed the ideas of the characters with stylistic variations. So this is what was responsible for the morphing of the characters over time, okay? This caused very, very different ways of writing various characters. This explains why most of today's Chinese characters differ so much from the original early pictographs. This is why the discovery of the ancient oracle bones and tortoiseshell plastrons, the oldest known extant Chinese writing, is so significant to the purpose of deciphering the meaning of the original pictographs. So in China, it is well documented that long before the polytheistic religions of Buddhism and Taoism, the Chinese once believed in the one supreme being. His name is Shangdi. We'll talk about him a little more later. But the ancient Chinese pictograph of Shangdi is a combination of two meanings, above and emperor. And ancient Chinese language also includes Satan and the devil, which is composed of the characters for garden or field, alive, secret, private, and man's son. And we'll actually talk about the significance of that later. It also clearly shows that creation involved using dust and mud. This written language was developed thousands of years ago. So let's get into some of these specifics. The symbol for holy is comprised of a combination of hands, which would be referring to God's hands in this case, it's clear, and earth and clay. Now it's interesting because the Bible says, "Yet, O Lord, you are our Father. You are the clay, you are the potter, we are the work of your hand." That's in Isaiah 64:8. But in Job 10:8 through 9, has an even more interesting account of how God molded us out of clay. The symbol for great and good is man and earth and clay. Again, man was created from the dust of the ground. Okay. And there's several more references of this about us being clay and him molding us with his hands. That's just a couple. And the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Genesis 2:7. And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. Okay, so man would have been good originally as well. Okay, until he sinned. The character for garden signifies an irrigated field. The biblical reference is interesting. Better understanding of the significance of the radical for garden will prove to expose additional details that are amazing. Genesis 2:10 says that now a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parted and became four. Okay, so imagine this being the boundaries of the garden, because this box by itself is an enclosure. Okay. And then this, with this added to it, is a garden, okay? And then if it's got a God symbol sticking out the top, it's a great garden. But anyways, we'll get into that later. But the rivers originate from the center of the garden and flow in four directions. Now these are likely referring to the Pishon, the Kion, the Tigris, and the Euphrates rivers that are mentioned in the Bible. Note, the original Garden of Eden was completely destroyed by the flood. And it just amazing that more Christians are not familiar with really what happened. This is why, no one's going to find the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is gone. The surface of the earth was completely eroded. Probably 1,000 to 2,000 feet worth of sediments were eroded during the flood. Okay, so I'm sorry, but if it wasn't eroded, it was covered by thousands of feet of sediment material. Okay, and the only reason why we still have the Tigris and the Euphrates is the same reason why New England has England in it, because it reminded someone of England. So they just carried the name over, okay? So that's important to note. There is also an additional significance of this symbol that is beyond the scope of this short lecture, and therefore I won't get into it. But there is additional characters that show, there are additional characters that show there was a hill at the center of the Garden of Eden, and that the source of the living water, which was a spring, was of God. So God was actually the source of the spring. And there are other characters that clearly symbolize the fountain of life, which again gets a little complicated, but we have to analyze a lot of other characters to do that. Okay, moving on. If you take 3 hands and a tree, okay, and then add 2 mouths to it, that makes up the ideogram of to die or perish. Okay? So, coincidence? Now the serpent was more crafty. As God said, now these are snippets of 6 different verses, but it's important. Now the serpent was more crafty. As God said, this is Satan talking to Eve, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? The serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. And when the woman saw that the tree was for good food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and ate it. Okay? This is interesting because if you look at no or negative, it's comprised of the radical serpent plus 2 trees. So you have the 2 trees, one being the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? And then the ideogram for to desire or covet is comprised of woman and 2 trees. Now that's really interesting that exact wording is actually in the Bible. Is that just a coincidence? Okay, to stumble and fall is 2 persons, stop plus garden. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking through the garden, and God said, have you eaten of the tree whereof I commanded you that you should not eat? So this could actually be referring to God walking through the garden, stopping, or that they shouldn't have done what they did. They should have stopped doing what they did. Very interesting. Then death is comprised of bad plus serpent. Now the Bible clearly says that death entered into the world, okay, through man's sin. Okay, and the first sin was due to the serpent deceiving Eve. Okay, the serpent deceived me, and I ate. Genesis 3:13. Mourn is comprised of the radicals person, probably referring to Adam in this case, plus serpent. In the book of Genesis, God told, and we'll cover many more of these, by the way. In the book of Genesis, God told Adam that he may eat from any tree, except he could not eat from the forbidden tree, forbidden, of the knowledge of good and evil. God warned Adam and told him that if he ate from it, that he would surely die. Genesis 2:17. Death and suffering entered into the world when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and ate from the forbidden tree. Now, if you look at the symbol for forbidden, or to warn, it's 2 trees and God. So God basically told them what not to do, okay, what is forbidden. The Bible also says that God spoke the world into existence and made Adam and animals from the dust of the ground. Now, if you look at this at the ideogram for to create, it's comprised of the radicals and ideograms of to speak, dust or mud, life, and walk. Coincidence? The Bible says that he made Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:8. The Garden of Eden was partially isolated. God made Adam from the dust of the ground and breathed life into him. After they sinned, Notice the breathe, that's important. After they sinned against or disobeyed God, they were banished from the garden. The ground was cursed, and man had to work harder to grow crops. So let's look at garden. This is a newer ideogram for garden. Okay, the first one was ancient, and this is newer. Is comprised of dust, breath, two persons, enclosure equals garden. The Bible says that Satan, the devil, undercover or disguised, came into the garden in the form of a serpent to secretly tempt Eve into eating from the forbidden tree. Okay? She could not resist the temptation. She was convinced that she could be like God herself. So let's look at tempter. This is pretty interesting. The ideogram for tempter is comprised of secret plus man plus garden plus alive, which is the devil. And then if you add to that two trees and cover, it is tempter. Very interesting. The punishment for a woman's sin against God is that childbirth will be very painful. In Genesis 3:16, I will greatly multiply your sorrow or pain and your conception. In sorrow you shall bring forth children. She ate a piece of fruit from the forbidden tree. Genesis 3:6. Okay? The Chinese ideogram for sorrow or pain is comprised of the following pictograms. A piece and two trees. Again, coincidence? The punishment for man's sin against God, in Genesis 3:17 through 19, is that they were banished from the garden, the ground would be cursed, and man would have to toil and work the gardens harder in order for it to bear food. The Chinese ideogram for bitter is comprised of the following pictograms. Weeds plus ancient. Now it's interesting because if you look at it, it's 10, in this case probably referring to fingers, okay, plus mouth, okay, equals ancient plus plants or weeds equals sorrow or bitter. So, I don't know, the last time you guys ate, this is just a side note. Last time you ate a weed, it's kind of bitter, isn't it? I'm just kidding. Anyways, okay, so you can see how the modern Chinese characters have changed slightly, but they are still similar enough to easily identify them with the ancient characters. Some have morphed a lot. Some have kind of stayed very, very, very similar. Similar enough where you can actually tell that they're the same. The parallels between the history in the book of Genesis and the ideograms in Chinese language are beyond pure chance. There must have been knowledge shared. There is also an amazing correlation between the account of Noah's flood in the Bible and the flood legends found in ancient Chinese history. The other fascinating thing is that a lamb is associated with a noble person. This is directly related to biblical sacrifice, and that Jesus is referred to as the Lamb of God. Now we're going to talk about that a little more later. It's really fascinating. God sacrificed His only Son so that we may have our sins forgiven and have eternal life. That our sins will be covered by His sacrifice. Okay, we'll see the significance of that later. In the book of Genesis 4:1 through 4, it tells of how the older son of Adam, Cain, killed his brother Abel out of jealousy and anger. In the Chinese language, the word for older brother is pronounced shun. Now, this is the phonetic way it's pronounced. The interesting thing is that the word for cruel and violent has the same pronunciation. Coincidence? What's more of a coincidence is the difference between the two is an X, a mark. Notice the X on the cruel character. Genesis 4:12 through 15 tells about how God put a mark on Cain that designated him as a murderer. And oftentimes an X is symbolic of a cut. Is this a coincidence? Let's look at some more here. Suitable or prepare. is comprised of hand, God's hand, plus a woman. Now, that by itself would be kind of, yeah, whatever, but God did not want man to be alone, so with his hands, he created a suitable partner for him. Okay, this is in both the Jiakuen Pin 12:10 and also in Genesis 2:18. And here's this is kind of interesting. Now, what you have to do, you got to be creative here. I mean, if you're an atheist, you got to go, what else could this mean? Okay, place of rest. Okay, is comprised of a house. Okay, plus 7. And the Bible says in Exodus 20:11, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So God rested on the 7th day. And in Chinese language, oftentimes, I think it's for calm. The symbol for calm is a house over a woman. So house is is typically associated with a place of rest, of peace, and then having the number 7 in it is I think more than just a coincidence. Now, starting our analysis of the flood, okay, this is kind of interesting. If you look at the ideogram for large boat, it's actually comprised of a vessel, 8, and mouth. You guys may have seen this. This is probably, if anybody has seen anything about this topic, they may have seen this. The 8 persons in the ark that Genesis declares is apparently knowledge that the ancient Chinese were aware of this. I mean, look at this. Okay, oftentimes mouth is used to mean a person, okay, in different ideograms. Even though it means mouth, when it's used in various other ideograms, it's actually referring to a person. And then 8, and then a vessel. So let's, I'm also going to look at the Chinese flood legends too. So we'll find this interesting. What I have here is flood legends from just a sampling of about 235, I think, if my memory serves me right, flood legends from various parts of the world. Okay, and you can kind of see they're compared here. Green means it's a full representation of the biblical concept. Okay, and then the orange pyramid it's a partial representation of what the biblical account actually says. It is obvious that there is an incredible amount of consistency between the ancient flood legends from various cultures from all over the world. The similarities between the Bible's flood account and the ancient Chinese flood legends are extraordinary, as you can see. Humans saved, ark provided, universal destruction, landing on a mountain, survivors were worshipped, birds sent out to find plant life, and others. Though China has a high number of congruencies, it should be obvious, based on this chart, that there had to have been a flood that impacted societies all over the world. In a matter of fact, secular scientists are finally starting to realize that there's something to this, so they're scurrying around trying to find out what sort of natural, whether it be an impactor or something, what sort of natural catastrophic event could have impacted these hundreds of civilizations. So they're busy at work trying to do that. So, the survivors of Noah's flood allowed for the repopulation of the earth. The 8 people that survived Noah's flood were able to pass on their knowledge to their descendants about technology and all the know-how, including shipbuilding. After all, they survived the worst ocean navigation event that's ever took place. But anyways, they would have been able to pass this knowledge down. And the time prior to the 1600 years prior to the flood, mankind was able to acquire an extraordinary amount of knowledge and technology. They weren't the dumb people that we're all taught, back, that we're getting smarter and smarter as every century goes by. That's absolutely ridiculous. Matter of fact, probably just the opposite's happening, which is a completely different subject. But it was their responsibility to pass on knowledge. So the ancient Chinese ideograph for to hand down or continue is made up of the following radicals or pictographs. Water plus 8, again, the 8 survivors of the ark, plus mouth, which would represent people. So the 8 people from the water, okay, continued or handed down. Coincidence? Okay, let's look real quick at the flood accounts. Chinese flood legends were recorded in many Zhou dynasty texts, but the 2nd century BC writing, the Wai Nan Zhu, I think, records the whole story. This may explain the later confusion between the creation of man by God and the creation of man by Noah in China. Look at the apparent influence from the Bible. It obviously was distorted over many centuries. But again, you ask yourself, is this a coincidence? So Noah, or Nuku, Noah, the 4 pillars covenant on earth were broken. In Genesis 6:11, the earth was corrupt before God. The whole habitable world was destroyed by fires in an unstoppable flood. Genesis 7:23, so he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground and the birds of the air. The 9 provinces were split apart. Genesis 8:2, the fountains of the deep rent upheaval in the earth. Nuku alone saved the world when he patched the heavens. Genesis 6:8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Stones of 5 colors patched the azure of heaven. Genesis 9:13, I set my rainbow in a cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant. Nuka fashioned mankind. We are all descendants of Noah. There are curious links between many different ancient languages. There has been research on the apparent connection between the Sumerian language, the oldest known literary language of man, and the Chinese language. It has been shown that there is remarkable similarity in the phonetic structure of individual words and compounds. It is comparable to that which now exists in Chinese. In fact, there are so many syllables that have the same sound that it is hard to distinguish between them sometimes. While there is no direct evidence for this relationship, the statistical chances of this occurring by chance is near 0. The conclusion is that the Sumerian language is related to the language of China, and that the first Chinese immigrants were related not just linguistically, but racially. They migrated to China about 4,500 years ago. Again, remember, the spoken language was supernaturally created, not the written language. The Chinese script, which began to blossom during the first great dynasty of China, the Shang dynasty, 1500 to 1100 BC, appears later than Egyptian hieroglyphic, probably because Egypt existed a few generations before China. The Chinese radicals, or signs, themselves seem to have been created indigenously. Okay, there's no real evidence that they were brought to China, that they were created somewhere else. But the writing system closely resembles the Near Eastern scripts. Obviously, we're influenced by them, in being composed of several hundred pictograms, rebuses, and semantic determinatives. Ancient Chinese language, like Sumerian, contained mostly words of 1 syllable, which allowed for the Chinese to construct their own unique words using a combination of various individual symbols. Another interesting fact is that the paleographic analysis shows that Egyptians appear to have gotten the idea that one could write with pictograms and rebuses from the Mesopotamians around 3000 BC. The timeline of the development of ancient Egyptian language is contemporaneous to when the Mesopotamians invented true writing. The origins of both Chinese and Egyptian languages and others appear to have been heavily influenced by the Mesopotamian region during the time frame of the Babel dispersion. The development of ancient Chinese writing may have occurred during the reign of the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi. There is an interesting link between Sumerian hieroglyphs and Chinese heavenly stems. Okay, 10 of the first characters of Chinese writing, the heavenly stems, were supposedly developed by one of Huang Di's ministers. So if you look at the comparisons between this first column and this last column, very interesting. Certainly some sort of influence there, or some sort of maybe they remembered and used the same characters. Mystery concerns the 450-year-old Temple of Heaven complex in Beijing, China. Why did the emperor sacrifice a bull on the great white marble altar of heaven at an annual ceremony, the year's most important and colorful celebration, the so-called border sacrifice ceremony? This ritual ended in 1911 when the last emperor was deposed, but the sacrifice did not begin a mere 450 years ago. The ceremony goes back some 4,000 years before the first dynastic rule, which began in about 2205 BC. So one of the earliest accounts of the border sacrifice is found in the Shujing, the Book of History, compiled by Confucius, where it is recorded of Emperor Shun, who ruled from about 2256 BC to 2205 BC, when the first recorded dynasty began, that, quote, he sacrificed to Shangdi, end quote. And there's much more of reference to Shangdi in the Book of History, but we'll actually talk about a little later. Okay, evidence that Shangdi is the god of the Bible. Let's look at the Temple of Heaven complex in Beijing, China. Again, this is where they moved the border sacrifice from the eastern border to southern Beijing. Okay, this is the map of it, and it's comprised of the Imperial Vault and the Hall of Prayer for good harvests, and then of course the Altar of Heaven. I got it, I think. Okay. The Temple of Heaven complex has been in Beijing, China since the 15th century AD. The earliest accounts of this border sacrifice from the Shujing, the Book of History, again, recorded that the old location for the ceremonies of sacrifices to Shangdi on the altar that was located on top of Mount Tai at the eastern border of China, as I said. So this is kind of, what it looks like, a beautiful place. Inside both the Imperial Vault and the Hall of Prayer and Good Harvests is an inscription. Now, it's in both of these. It's an inscription, Heavenly Sovereign Shangdi. So bulls were sacrificed on the altar of heaven, okay, which is here. Now this is kind of a, I kind of show this a little clearer here, but in both temples it has this. And this is the symbol, they have it above, of course, and this is the newer version of Shangdi. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So what was the origin of the ceremony? In order to explain the reason for the emperor's bull sacrifice to Shangdi, we need to compare this Chinese sacrifice with the instruction given by God to the Hebrews. Okay? Quote, take thee a young calf for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering without blemish, and offer them before the Lord. Leviticus 9:2. And there's also earlier references of this practice in Genesis 4:3 through 4 and Genesis 8:20. It is obvious that the ritual shares its origins with the sacrificial rituals found in the Bible. The best explanation is that the early Chinese were descendants of Noah's clan. Now there was animal sacrifice in a lot of different cultures throughout the world, but there were only 2 monotheistic civilizations. So back then, the Mesopotamian region, the Hebrews and all that. The statutes of the Ming Dynasty. Well, let me back up a second and correct that. We have evidence for just 2. Okay, there's probably many others, but what's great is that if we didn't have this information in this symbolic language, and it's great, because the Egyptians were obviously practiced a religion much different than what the Hebrews practiced. Okay, but anyways, from the statutes of the Ming Dynasty concerning the border sacrifice ceremony, here's some verbiage from that. While we celebrate his great name, what limit can there be, or what measure? Forever he sitteth fast the high heavens, and establisheth the solid earth. His government is everlasting. His unworthy servant, I bow my head, I lay it in the dust, bathed in his grace and glory. End quote. And then the final song after the sacrificial bullock has been slaughtered is, we have worshipped and written the great name on this gem-like sheet. Now we display it before D, which is Shang Di, and place it in the fire. All the ends of the earth look up to him. All human beings, all things on the earth look up to him. All human beings, all things on the earth rejoice together in his great name. And even the doctrine of the mean, the Zongyang, the ceremonies of the celestial and terrestrial sacrifices are those by which men serve Shang Di. And that was written by Confucius, or recorded by him. Okay, the Tao of Laozi, okay, and Laozi was the founder of Taoism during the 6th century BC, by the way. Something mysteriously already made, existing before heaven and earth, in the silence, in the void, ever present in constant motion. Perhaps he is the source of myriads of things. I do not know his name, call him Tao. For lack of a better word, I call him the Almighty. Man follows the earth follows the heavens follow the Tao follows his own way. The Tao exists as one exists as two exists as three, and three create everything. This is probably one of the earliest references to the Trinity. Come ye near unto me, hear ye this, I have not spoken in secret from the beginning, from the time that it was, there am I. And now the Lord God and his Spirit hath sent me. Isaiah 48:16. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these three are one. 1 John 5:7. Heaven gave the pattern, and the holy man followed it. The border sacrifice is to manifest the Tao of heaven. By the ceremonies of sacrifices to heaven and earth, they serve God. In the character for righteousness, we find the sheep, like a garment covering over me. What is interesting is that me is composed of the radicals for hand and weapon, or a lance. That is likely referring to the killing instrument used during sacrifices. The sacrificial lamb of God covers our sins. So if you look at hand, lance, me, lamb, means righteousness. So we're only righteous when our sins are covered by his sacrifice. Very interesting. Zhuang Xuan, early Han Dynasty, said Shang Di is another name for heaven, okay, or Tian. Mozi in 408 to 382 BC, somewhere around that time, wrote, I know heaven, Shang Di, loves men dearly, not without reason. Heaven, or Shang Di, because remember, they called their god heaven. Okay, it's different. We call heaven a place. Heaven, Shang Di, ordered the sun, the moon, and the stars to enlighten and guide them. Heaven, Shang Di, ordained the 4 seasons. So heaven, or God, is comprised of great or noble and above. Now, this is important because we'll actually get into some of the refutation of this later. So this demonstrates that the Creator is a person and that we are created in his image. So it's clear. Complete person, okay, plus above is to manifest, or the God radical. And then a person plus above is referring to beginning, first, or head, okay? And just a side note, we don't have time to get into this today, but there's also amazing reference to the blood of God and the ancient characters and the prophecy. This is prophetic stuff of the shedding of blood for our sins. But we won't cover this because it's a little more complicated. There's lots of characters we have to analyze to set it up. But anyways, 3 persons, plus above equals to manifest, show, or the God radical, the Trinity. This probably represents the members of the Godhead. And if we look at the symbol for Shangdi, this is the ancient, this is how it appears in the oracle bones, and this is how it appears now. And then heaven, so you can see how they've evolved over time. But anyways, you can see that there are 4 characters that represent the God of heaven, okay? And they're used different ways, okay, in different ideograms, in different references. As I mentioned before, written Chinese language has morphed and changed over the many millennia. The characters to the right are the more modern representation for the character for Shangdi, which is comprised of emperor and then above or heavenly, okay? Also written Shang-Ti. You'll see this Shangdi or Shang-Ti. It's one and the same, just various 2 different spellings. Most, if not all, Chinese characters have slowly undergone this sort of change. Many ancient characters have been forgotten and lost completely because the original meaning has been forgotten, and due to the replacement religions. So let's look at rain. Okay, rain is made up of above plus 3, okay, plus water. Now, early Zhao meaning is to fall from heaven. Okay, of this. Could this mean the Holy Spirit? Is this the Holy Spirit raining down on us? Be glad then, ye children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he hath given you the former rain moderately, and he will cause to come down for you the rain, the former rain, and the later rain in the first month. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions, and also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days I will pour out my Spirit. That's in Joel 2. But looking at the original oracle bone rendering of Shangdi, it's also amazing to find a prophetic revelation within the makeup of the character. This character signifies Jesus who came down from heaven in this particular makeup of the ideogram I'm referring to. Signifies Jesus who came down from heaven, and the tree radical represents the cross in which he would be nailed upon. Okay? So, Christ, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree. Okay? So, if you look at this ideogram for Shangdi, okay, it's comprised of fuel, a tree. A tree would be would be representative of the cross. The fuel would be the fuel for sacrifice, okay, plus morally upright, which is comprised of the Trinity plus a person, Christ in the flesh. So this is really neat. So going back to that, we have the fuel radical signifies the fact that Jesus Christ himself became the fuel used in the sacrifices. So coincidence? I have provided only a small sampling of the ancient Chinese written characters. There are hundreds of more examples of how the written language of the ancient Chinese provides evidence that the creators of the characters were intimately familiar with the historical accounts of the book of Genesis. Many of these additional examples are much more complicated and require a lot of setup, like I said before, so we won't get into them. But I encourage you to do some further studying on your own. At the end of the presentation, I do have references to books I suggest. The final song after the sacrificial bull has been slaughtered, again, the very end, you can read that for yourself, but very interesting. So really, it is said in the book of history, we have waited for our prince. When our prince comes, we may escape from the punishments under which we suffer. Okay? It boils down to Shangdi is Jesus. The reason this issue has remained undiscovered for so long is because, like I said, the lack of cross-knowledge between the Bible and the Chinese. Most Western people have only basic knowledge of the Chinese history, and most people in China have little or no knowledge of the Bible. And in fact, teachers educated in communist China have serious trouble in understanding the real history of China because the history has been politicized to make it compatible with communist ideology. Chinese students have been taught lies. Students are taught that Isaac Newton only became interested in religion when he got old and senile, as an example. How many Chinese people know that Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, was motivated by a strong Christian faith? Probably not many. Much knowledge has been erased from modern history and has been distorted for political reasons. The other problem is that most people only know the modern versions of many ancient Chinese writings and are not familiar with the actual Chinese classics, which are written in the traditional script. Since much of the script has changed over time, the pictographs and ideograms have morphed enough to obscure some of the original symbolic meanings. So secular evolutionary scientists are trying to push a rewritten history of Earth civilizations on unsuspecting people. They are also trying to convince people that we evolved from ape-like ancestors and are nothing but evolved pond scum. What they do not want you to know is that the ancient teachings of the Chinese, along with the accounts in the Bible, reveal the first people on Earth were intelligent human beings created in the likeness of God himself. The Chinese border sacrifice ceremony recitations from the earliest dynasties stated that God loves all of us. Shangdi literally means God above, and from the beginning of their history, the ancient Chinese worshipped Shangdi as the creator of all things. The Chinese in antiquity worshipped the same God as Christians do today. Like the Hebrews often did, the ancestors of today's Chinese wandered off after other gods. The memory of who their original God was dimmed with time. And a lot of this was forced upon them by emperors and their preferences. But the ancient Chinese script gives powerful evidence for the historical truth of Genesis. In summary, it is clear that the written language of the Chinese was developed during the primeval monotheistic period when the religious concepts and history passed down through oral tradition were fresh in their minds. The later influx of other religions and other religious inventions, like ancestor worship, caused both the memories and the written language to be muddied and the true original meanings faded and mostly forgotten. The Bible says that people groups from all over the earth are closely related. It's important that people know that we have answers to the questions that people have about the supposed conflicts between secular history and what the Bible says. All Asians are descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The relatives would have had knowledge of the flood and other biblical history. The world needs to know that science has not disproved the accuracy of the Bible. We must believe what the Bible says about material or earthly things, like evidence for the flood, for example, or the origin of the stars, origin of life, and etc., are 100% true. If we don't believe in the material things that are very obvious as far as being wonderfully created, then how could we believe in spiritual things of the Bible, like morality and salvation? So the Bible is a big picture history book that provides answers to any question that an evolutionist would ask. And myself, or if I can't get them the answer, I know someone who does, or who can. We need to go into the world and let people know that the Bible is the inerrant Word of God that we can trust in. Evolutionary science does not have the answers. And if you guys are interested in learning more about some of this stuff, I would encourage you to study some creation science literature, and it'll expose just how ridiculous some of these supposed scientific theories are as far as they don't hold any weight. Most of them are ridiculous, and they're constructs to try to explain what is obvious, that all this stuff was created. And the Big Bang cosmology is one example of that. But anyways, we must never forget that there is a religious and spiritual worldview battle, God or no God. That's really what's going on. The Bible has proven itself to be the ultimate authority, and we need to understand that all laws are essentially based on ethics and moral values. There are people who think that morality should not and cannot be legislated by the government. They are ignorant of the fact that most laws are based on absolutes themselves, that are themselves based on someone's moral rights and wrongs. Secular humanists and evolutionists do not believe in absolute standards of right and wrong. This is destroying the moral foundations of our country. Our founding fathers based their Constitution on Christian morality. Nowhere does the First Amendment say separation of church and state. It only says that there shall be no national denomination. The courts have misinterpreted and distorted the First Amendment. That's certainly not what our forefathers had in mind. We as Christians need to take a stand against the attempted destruction of the Christian church's foundations by the humanists and evolutionists. So God bless you all, and may we all be empowered by the Holy Spirit to go out and do some research on our own and investigate what history and archaeological sciences actually tell us that support the actual historical references in the Bible. And we can share that knowledge, and we can share those examples with people, and it might be enough to get them to actually open up their mind a little bit and contemplate and consider whether or not Christianity is something that, as an atheist, would consider researching at least. And later they might be able to come to the truth with an open mind. But hopefully the Holy Spirit can work in the minds and hearts of your friends and colleagues. And I appreciate all your time. Again, God bless you all, and maybe we'll see you at the next conference. For those of you who want to stick around, there's about 10 more slides that gets into the claims of the critics and how those claims are easily refuted, and also some reference material that you already have in your handouts. But any of you that would like to go now, please do so. If not, I'll probably... Okay. There have been many attacks on the claim that ancient Chinese language was formulated with the knowledge of the historical accounts of Genesis. There are two main claims that are used to attack this evidence. One is errors made in the so-called etymologies, and then the second is the Shangdi translation for God is a translation of a new word that was incorporated when missionaries arrived in China. Okay, so before I continue refuting this ridiculously ignorant set of claims made by some that there is no truth in Genesis being found in Chinese language, it is important to note that most, if not all, the criticism is based on the initial work of Kang and Nelson in their first groundbreaking publication, The Discovery of Genesis, which was written back in 1979. They don't criticize anything in their post-work. Well, there's a reason for that. So since then, the authors themselves have recognized several errors in their etymologies and have corrected them or removed them from their latter works and publications. So most critics, if not all, ignore the newer works by various authors and researchers. So choosing to criticize a work which the original authors and discoverers themselves consider as rather embryonic back in 1979. The work published since then has been in response to skeptical criticism and further research that they've done, and they've corrected any flaws or errors. And they've also found a lot more correlations that were previously undiscovered. This stuff's kind of, the more you understand it, the deeper it goes. So it's pretty fascinating. Okay, let's look at one real quick here. The whole Noah's Ark thing, okay, in the large vessel. The Chinese character for ship, okay, xuan, and there's a symbol, the symbol we're referring to, denotes three radicals: a vessel, and then 8, and then mouth, or people. Since Noah's Ark was a ship that carried 8 people, this could be the origin of the Chinese character. Now, some critics claim that the radical interpreted as 8 is not the same form as the way 8 is written in Chinese. Experts in Chinese written language easily address this argument by saying that everyone knows that the form of the radical used in the combined character for ship is just a stylized way of writing 8 when written by hand. The other argument sometimes made is that the interpretation of mouth as persons is disputed on the basis that the character itself only, means mouth or opening in modern dictionaries. However, it does not take much thought to realize that the phrase 8 mouths to feed means 8 people. So, although the modern Chinese ideogram does not seem to use mouth in precisely this way, it is used in many expressions about speech, and of course speech characterizes people. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to mean eating or anything. It's just referring to people. So furthermore, the earliest forms of writing, the oracle bones, which predate Moses, show that the original radical was used in that way to represent a person. Okay? Other critics claim that this symbol is not even composed of three components, but is actually only composed of two. Okay? They claim that the left side of the ideogram represents a boat, but the right side is a second component that is used for the ancient sound of the word. Okay, for example, this part of it right here is a phonetic origin-based character, which is also used in led and along. Okay. They claim that the phonetic combination is another way Chinese characters were developed, not just symbolic combinations. Now that's true, but only later on. Here you'll see. The critics are obviously ignorant on how Chinese language developed. Experts in Chinese language have been involved in this research, and they argue that the original Chinese writing was ideographic, as revealed on the oracle bones, and that the use of some of the radicals or combinations of radicals for phonetic purposes came later. Okay? The Chinese character for ship in modern times is known to be comprised of two parts. The one on the left having a semantic meaning, or a semantic purpose or meaning, and the combination of the two radicals on the right having a phonetic purpose, a phenome. But the analysis of ancient Chinese writing is not based on modern characters, but on the older forms of the Chinese writing, i.e. the oracle bone scripts. So, how did the phonetic concept develop? It seems clear that the semantic had to have come first, because if the phenome on the right-hand side of this symbol is composed of two radicals that actually have the meaning suggested when in other contexts, then if the original writing involved phenomes, why would they be composed of semantic radicals? It doesn't make any sense. So this cannot be due to just coincidence, by the way, that they're used in that way. It is easy to address the critics' claim that Shangdi was a new word that was added after Christian missionaries visited China. Okay, Shangdi basically means supreme sovereign, and it goes back a long way. Again, the imperial palace in Beijing has a temple built in 1530 called the Vault of Heaven, and it has a tablet on the north wall that reads Heavenly Emperor Shangdi that we looked at earlier. This predates any Protestant missionaries. But Shangdi obviously goes much further back in time, because the antiquity of Shangdi is shown in ancient Chinese literature. In fact, the Shu Jing, the book of history compiled by Confucius in 500 BC, records that Emperor Shun, from the legendary period of 5 emperors, predated the first dynasty about 4,000 years ago, actually sacrificed to Shangdi. So this certainly predated any missionary activity to China. Okay. So some critics claim that that the symbol for Shangdi is just comprised of king, or that that the emperor, the symbol for emperor, is just referring to a king. Okay, and that this symbol is just sky and is not referring to above. Okay. Above and all are used to augment the meaning for Shangdi. Emperor and the character they claim did not have a heavenly origin. So let's just look at this for a second. If this symbol just means emperor and this symbol means king, one word or the other is superfluous. Okay, you don't need both. Furthermore, who was the emperor praying to in this hall of prayer for good harvests? Himself? According to the simplistic meanings given to each character by some critics, what does the ideogram mean? Well, does it just mean what they're claiming? Kingly sky above emperor. Okay, that doesn't make a whole lot. Okay, that's pretty ridiculous. Okay. Furthermore, the character for sky also means heaven in many dictionaries. In fact, this symbol is still used as a euphemism for God today. Much additional ancient Chinese documentation from ancient scholars such as Confucius and Laozi shows that the symbol for above meant, heavenly above meant far more than just sky. Some critics claim that Shangdi does not have a heavenly origin, but is just a title claimed by a ruler. Okay? It is true that some emperors did claim this title, but why would a ruler claim this title? Simply because it is the title of the creator God himself, the highest title one could claim. So the Roman emperors did the same thing, but instead of lifting their own status, I should say, they merely devalued the Word of God. Okay? In addition of above to this symbol here that comprises Shangdi, probably arose intentionally to distinguish the creator from an earthly god, such as an emperor. So it was added specifically to separate the two. I mean, how many emperors are... So it is obvious that the connection between Genesis and the ancient Chinese language is irrefutable. No successful rational argument has been made yet. What is important to understand is that the main reason a person would not believe the material in this presentation is that they are very dogmatic in their belief that the Bible is not what it claims to be. They are so blinded by their atheistic beliefs that they are unable to accept any evidence that supports the Bible. So we as Christians must continue to aggressively research and study history and science so that we can uncover additional evidence for the authority of the Bible. A comment for the atheists who watch this or read this. If the Bible is true, then the only way to discover the actual true history of mankind is to accept the knowledge contained in the Scriptures. So you're running the risk of, if the Bible is true, and you're ignoring it, and intentionally not accepting anything in it, you will never come to the truth. That's called the blind spot that exists in secular science. So ancient Chinese language is amazing evidence for the authority of the Bible, and I encourage you all to further research archaeological evidence for the biblical timelines, and also the books here that I would suggest that focus on the analysis of Chinese characters and their correlation to the book of Genesis. And then, of course, I have some suggested readings that talk about genealogies and archaeological evidence and things like that. And I would strongly recommend Noah to Abram. It's a great book. And but anyways, if you guys can ever get around to finding the time to read outside of, I know everyone has a busy schedule, but thanks again for coming. I appreciate it, and again, God bless you all.
Here nestled in the quiet community of Copley, Ohio, a few miles west of Akron, Ohio, on the corner of Minor and South Cleveland-Massillon Road, is a challenge to the conventional thought of modern man. A museum is asking visitors 4 vital questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is my purpose here, and where will I go when I die? The Akron Fossils and Science Center poses these questions, but also frames a paradigm based on the Bible, on science and recent scientific discoveries. Founder Bill Sanderson has set the course of the Akron Fossils and Science Center to produce in the visitor an understanding of how we answer the question of origins will determine how we view ourselves, our families, our community, our nation, and our world. Are we products of accidental random processes over billions of years? Are we instead the products of design with a purpose and a designer who has masterminded all that we observe? Because it is not possible to test scientifically and empirically an event that has occurred in the past, we must look to the evidence before us to seek to answer the following. Does the evidence best support an evolutionary model or a creation science model? Which of the models best predicts what we observe and are able to test? You see, truth begs for scrutiny and falsehood begs for tolerance. Come see our fascinating fossils and displays as we pose the questions of life and open the doors to truth. The Akron Fossils and Science Center is a museum and science center which is devoted to teaching creation science and intelligent design models in contrast to evolutionary models. The center features hands-on science as well as many fossils from Ohio and around the world. Individuals, families, as well as groups will enjoy our interesting displays as they journey through the series of questions in search of truth.